The seventh stab slid straight into Domitian's ribs, and the Emperor of Rome, the man who had burned and ripped apart thousands with glowing hot irons, clawed wildly at his attacker's eyes. Blood spread like spilled paint across the shining marble floor of the palace, where he had ruled through fear for 15 long years. Around him stood 7 men, each driving their blade with memories of a different cruelty he had forced them to witness. The Emperor, who had once prided himself on stretching out pain for as long as possible, now thrashed like a trapped beast, his fingernails raking Stephanus's face even as his strength faded. It was September 18th, 96 CE, and Rome's most merciless ruler was finally learning the truth his victims had always known. Once violence is set loose, it always comes back to claim its master. The man who had made torture into a twisted performance was now starring in his own bloody finale, his last masterpiece etched across the imperial floor. But how did a Roman emperor grow into such a monster that even his closest allies celebrated the thought of his death? How did someone born into wealth and power turn into history's most imaginative butcher? To understand the 7 blades that ended Domitian's reign, we need to step back through years of echoing chambers filled with screams, through carefully planned acts of terror, through the slow destruction of everything Rome once held sacred. It's a journey back to watch how a forgotten prince turned himself into a beast. On the evening of September 17, 96 CE, the night before the killing, Stephanus could barely hold his wine steady. His goblet trembled as Domitian lifted his own cup high, pretending to toast loyalty. The great banquet hall sparkled with gold and jewels, yet beneath the glitter lay hidden knives, their cold steel pressed against sweating skin. 24 guests sat around the table, though only 7 of them knew this was the tyrant's last supper. Domitian's sharp eyes roamed across the room like a wolf scanning sheep. Senators, freedmen, even members of his own family, all had been summoned for what he called a feast celebrating his godlike rule. The emperor traced the edge of his cup with one finger, and every guest froze. They knew that whenever he played with his wine, someone's blood was usually spilled before the night was done. His mood tonight felt darker than ever. He talked of loyalty while fixing his glare on Parthenos, his chamberlain. He spoke of trust while locking eyes with Stephanus. The cruelty was almost unbearable. Here sat the master of torment, surrounded by men he had broken again and again, men who could barely keep their rage hidden. Then Domitian said something that made their blood run cold. He began describing his newest invention, a torture chair, forged with iron spikes that could be heated from below. He explained with a wicked smile how the spikes would slide just deep enough to avoid killing a person, leaving them alive to suffer for days. With every breath, he said, their own weight will push the glowing points deeper. His voice shone with excitement, as if he were describing a fine piece of art. Parthenos' hands shook as he poured more wine, silently praying that by tomorrow this creature would be gone, or else all of them would be nailed to that burning chair. The feast dragged on painfully, every dish like another test of their nerves. Domitian himself brought food to certain guests, pretending it was a humble gesture, though everyone knew it was a warning. When he placed a platter before Senator Nerva, he leaned close and whispered, "Loyalty, like good wine, grows finer under pressure." His words slithered through the hall like a snake, tightening around every heart. As midnight neared, Domitian stood for his final toast. He spoke casually of what was to come: new punishments, more names for execution, fresh devices for his torture chambers. Each word made someone at the table squirm. His smile said it all. Tomorrow someone here would die. What he didn't know was that his guests had already chosen who that victim would be. One by one, the guests slipped into the night, each goodbye feeling like it might be their last. When Domitian clasped Stephanus's hand at the door, he held on just long enough to feel the man's pulse racing. "Until tomorrow, my faithful servant," he said softly, his voice turning a simple farewell into a sentence of death. As the last of the guests slipped into the Roman night, Stephanus kept his hand tight around the blade hidden beneath his toga. He knew that in less than half a day, either Domitian would lie dead, or he and the others would be screaming inside the emperor's dreaded torture chambers. The next morning, firewood cracked and hissed, heating the monstrous bronze bull that stood like a demon in the center of the execution hall. That year 95 CE was the height of Domitian's campaign against Christians, and the chamber had turned into a place where human suffering was crafted like a cruel art. The bronze bull, first imagined by the Greeks, had been refined under Domitian's watchful eye. He had ordered new vents cut into the metal so that the cries of the condemned would rise as twisted music, what he smugly called the Symphony of Justice. On this day, the victim was Marcus, a Christian deacon who had refused to bow before the emperor's statue. Domitian himself came to witness, sitting high on a throne that overlooked the glowing chamber. The beast of bronze began to redden as the fire roared, and Domitian leaned forward with a dark satisfaction. He had even commanded his craftsmen to build a crystal window on the bull's side, strong enough to resist the heat so that he could gaze directly at the victim's torment. Through it, he watched Marcus writhe in pain, but then something unexpected happened. The screaming faded. In its place came the sound of singing. Marcus had begun chanting a Christian hymn from within the belly of the beast. The emperor's smile vanished. His face hardened as he snapped for more wood to be thrown onto the flames. The fire grew hotter, the bull's surface beginning to bend and groan, but still the voice continued, softer, weaker, yet never breaking. Soldiers stood around the chamber, men hardened by war, men who had crucified rebels and razed entire villages without pity. Yet the sound of Marcus's hymn carried through the vents, filling the chamber not with terror but with defiance. Several soldiers turned their heads away, unable to watch. One veteran, a scarred centurion who had fought in 20 campaigns, simply walked out, his retreat carefully marked by Domitian's furious eyes. The craftsman who had built the bull stood nearby, pride curdling into shame. He had designed the vents to magnify screams, never imagining they could carry songs instead. Each verse that rose out of the burning bull seemed to mock the emperor's power. Domitian's rage boiled over. Pointing at the craftsman, he barked an order. If this device could withstand hymns, then its creator would be tested inside it as well. The execution dragged on for 3 unbearable hours. When the bull was finally opened, Marcus's body was lifeless, but his face bore a calm expression that unsettled even the hardest of soldiers. Domitian ordered his body destroyed at once, but the whispers had already begun. Across Rome's hidden Christian circles, the story spread. Marcus had broken the emperor's pride with nothing but faith. For the first time, cracks began to show in Domitian's wall of fear. The cruelty did not stop there. In that same year, the emperor turned his fury toward his own blood. Senator Flavius Clemens, his cousin and childhood companion, was dragged into chains on charges of atheism, accused of showing mercy toward Christians and doubting Domitian's divinity. But everyone knew the real reason. Clemens was respected, admired, everything Domitian wished he could be. Now inside the suffocating walls of the torture chamber, family ties meant nothing. The emperor insisted on preparing the irons himself, heating them until they glowed, his face lit by the fire. He would not allow servants to handle this punishment. This was too personal. "Do you remember when we were children?" Domitian asked with a cold smile, pressing an iron against a strip of leather to test its heat. "You pushed me into the fountain after I beat you at dice. Father laughed at me while you stood there grinning." His voice was almost playful, but in his hands burned the same tools he had used to torment strangers. Now they were meant for his own cousin. The chamber seemed smaller than ever, its stone walls pressing in as the emperor prepared to burn away both blood and memory. People always chuckled when pain landed on me instead of them. The leather strip hissed as it burned, and once he was satisfied, Domitian moved toward his cousin with the glowing iron in hand. When the metal touched skin, It gave a sharp hiss, and over it came another sound: Domitian's laughter. It wasn't the manic shriek of a mad emperor, but the bitter laugh of a boy who had once been shoved into a fountain, dripping wet while everyone else roared with amusement at his humiliation. Every brand of the iron felt like he was erasing another memory from childhood moments when Clemens had been chosen, praised, and adored while he had been treated as little more than a shadow. "You know what always cut the deepest?" Domitian asked as he picked up a fresh iron. "You never even remembered doing it. Years later, when I brought it up, you had no memory at all. Just another cruel joke at my expense, wasn't it? Something so small it wasn't worth remembering." He pressed the next iron with deliberate care. The torture dragged on for hours, each burn carefully placed to keep Clemens conscious, forcing him to feel every second of it. Then, through cracked lips and a voice that barely rose above the sound of sizzling flesh, Clemens whispered something that struck harder than steel. "I remember now, cousin," he said, "and I'm sorry." "We all are." The words shattered Domitian. His hand shook, and the iron slipped from his grip, clattering against the stone floor. Yet Clemens's death would spark something the emperor never expected. His widow Domitilla would begin quietly gathering allies, and those allies would soon gather weapons. By then, Domitian's torture halls had become something more sinister than simple chambers of pain. They were laboratories of suffering, a place where cruelty was practiced with the precision of science. In 93 CE, Dr. Lucius, a physician once celebrated for saving wounded gladiators in the Colosseum, had then turned into the emperor's chief torturer. Where once his skill had mended broken bodies, now it was twisted to keep them alive in agony far longer than nature ever intended. An entire wing of the palace had been converted into what they called the innovation chamber. Its walls were covered with detailed sketches of the human body, not marked with notes on healing, but with arrows pointing to places most vulnerable to pain. Domitian demanded that torture be elevated above crude violence into a careful craft. And so Lucius refined the use of red-hot irons through endless experiments on condemned prisoners. "Temperature is everything," he explained to his apprentices while demonstrating on a shivering captive. "If it's too hot, the nerves are destroyed and the pain ends too quickly. Too cool, and it's little more than discomfort. But at the perfect heat, the body burns without mercy while the mind stays trapped inside." He even invented a color system: cherry red for surface burns, orange for deeper layers of flesh, and white hot reserved for the final unbearable climax. The irons came in every shape imaginable, each designed for a particular body part, each tested again and again. Lucius also discovered that combining certain burns, like the inner thigh followed by the lower back, multiplied the torment, creating pain greater than either wound on its own. He turned his findings into a torturer's manual, filled with chilling precision, mathematical formulas predicting exactly how long a victim could stay conscious at different levels of pain. The emperor's signature punishments, aimed at the most sensitive regions of the body, were perfected here. Lucius determined the exact temperatures and timings to cause maximum torment without letting the victim slip mercifully into unconsciousness. He even devised a system to cool their skin with damp cloths, slowing down their body's collapse so the suffering could stretch for hours. But this obsession with keeping victims awake had an unintended cost. Survivors, though broken, remembered everything: the faces of the men who tortured them, the whispered names exchanged in the chamber, the order of each cruel step. Some were eventually released, sent out as living warnings. Yet they carried not only scars, but memories, seeds of rebellion that would spread beyond Domitian's control. The secret maps of the torture halls, the rotation of the guards, even the cracks in the palace walls, nothing escaped the eyes of those who planned revenge. The same medical skill once used to keep broken bodies alive was now being studied by plotters to learn the quickest ways to strike 7 times and guarantee death. By the 3rd day, the sweet smell of honey could no longer hide the horror spreading through the gardens. This was a method borrowed from the Persians, but Domitian had twisted it into something even darker. Senator Aurelius was trapped between two wooden shells, his arms and legs sticking out like a cruel display. He was forced to drink milk and honey until his own body became a trap for him. On the first day, he was stripped bare, locked into place, and drenched in the sticky mixture. The liquid was poured into his mouth and smeared over every patch of exposed skin. By the second day, the sweetness called swarms of flies, wasps, and ants. But the real terror came later, when his body, bloated from the forced feeding, betrayed him with endless sickness. The stench filled the barrels, making the place feel like a pit of rot. Domitian visited daily, dragging along his young nephew as if it were a lesson in science. He described everything in a cold teacher's tone: how the honey lured insects that crawled inside, how the milk caused violent sickness that made the perfect home for pests, and how the sealed air made everything rot faster. The boy threw up on the fourth day, but Domitian forced him to return, saying he needed to see all of it. By the seventh day, the guards could no longer hold back their own sickness. Something crawled out of the senator's mouth that made even hardened soldiers collapse in disgust. And yet Aurelius still clung to life, his wide, desperate eyes following every movement around him. His body was no longer just his own worms squirmed beneath his skin. Maggots filled the open sores, and strange, choking sounds came from his throat as creatures moved inside. What made it unbearable was the setting. Birds still sang from nearby branches, flowers bloomed as if nothing was wrong, and servants tried to work in the gardens while the stink spread everywhere. The contrast between life and decay broke something in those forced to watch. Guards begged to be reassigned, but Domitian refused, ordering them to endure the entire 2-week ordeal. The insects weren't the only things multiplying. Hatred grew too inside every witness, every scribe who wrote down the details, every servant who had to clean the filth. They remembered Domitian's eager face as he spoke about the process, his delight when he saw a new stage of infestation, his pride in cataloging the misery. One guard who scrubbed the barrels burned every detail into memory. Years later, he would tell conspirators exactly how far their emperor's cruelty had gone. But the breaking point came not with Aurelius, but with the sacred Vestals. In the year 83 CE, the line Rome had respected for 1,000 years was crossed. The Vestal Virgins, the keepers of Rome's eternal flame, were symbols of the gods' favor. To harm them was to harm Rome itself. Yet Domitian, calling himself a god above all others, dared to accuse them of breaking their vows, though he offered no proof. The names were Oculata, Venila, and the elder priestess Cornelia. Draped in their white robes, they stood trembling in the torchlight of the underground chamber beneath the Colosseum. This was no public trial. Domitian wasn't foolish enough to display this crime in front of the masses. Instead, he summoned a handful of senators to watch in silence, forcing them to witness as he dragged Rome's holiest women into a darkness that even their gods might not forgive. The old way of punishing Vestal virgins who broke their vows was burial alive, a grim but quick death. But Domitian wasn't interested in tradition, he wanted something darker. In the underground chamber, red-hot irons waited in braziers, each shaped like the sacred tools the Vestals once used in their holy rituals. Everyone present understood the cruel symbolism. What once served the goddess would now serve as weapons of pain. Cornelia, the high priestess with 3 decades of service, stood tall despite the heat in the chamber. Her voice was calm but firm as she looked Domitian in the eye. "The goddess Vesta sees everything," she declared. "She knows truth from lies, sacred from defiled. And she sees you." The emperor answered not with words, but with action, searing the first iron against the embroidered symbols of Vesta woven into her robe. Cloth blackened, skin blistered, and the air filled with the smell of burning flesh. Even as her body burned, Cornelia's spirit did not falter. She began reciting the ancient prayers of her order, each word clear and strong. From the eternal flame, we take our strength. In the eternal flame, we find truth. To the eternal flame we return. Her steady prayers hit Domitian like arrows. Furious, he commanded her tongue cut out, but even then, with broken sounds and torn lips, she managed to force the sacred words into the air. The two younger Vestals, forced to watch in terror, were then offered a choice: renounce their vows and live, or share Cornelia's torment. They chose death, proving their faith mattered more than their lives. This act shattered a boundary Rome had honored for centuries. To harm the Vestals was to harm Rome itself, but Domitian no longer cared. In the shadowy crowd, a young senator named Nerva watched in silence, his heart heavy but his mind sharpening with new resolve. Not long after, the emperor stood before the Senate. 12 empty chairs lined the hall, each one once belonging to a senator he had tortured to death. The Curia Julia, once the heart of Roman wisdom, had become a theater of fear. Every seat told its own story of suffering, every absence a reminder of Domitian's paranoia. He would pause in his speeches to point at a chair, reliving the tortures as if they were entertainment. "Here sat Senator Gallus," he told them once. 6 days he lasted with the irons before his heart failed him. He admitted to plotting against me, though strangely, he never named his allies. Perhaps the pain clouded his memory. His words dripped with mockery, each tale twisting the knife of fear deeper. The Senate had become a game of survival. Every vote, every gesture, every expression had to be measured. Too much eagerness looked false. Too little seemed rebellious. They learned to watch Domitian's moods like sailors scanning the horizon for storms, praying to avoid his wrath. But as he spoke that day, all eyes drifted to the 13th chair, the next to be emptied. Its occupant already knew he was doomed. Senator Nerva had received his summons that very morning, an invitation to dine privately with the emperor, a well-known curtain call before an arrest. He sat in silence, memorizing faces, counting allies, preparing for a future he might never live to see. But unlike the 12 who had perished before him, Nerva had something they did not. He had friends within the Praetorian Guard soldiers just as weary of fear as he was. For now the executions followed a grim pattern: the public accusation in the Senate, the midnight arrest, and the long torture sessions where Domitian personally displayed his skill with the glowing irons. He treated agony as if it were art, describing his choices as though he were a craftsman showing off his work. Yet in secret, one senator had been keeping careful notes, writing down names, times, and every horrific detail. Those records would survive, even when their owner did not. Hidden away in his villa, Marcus Cuccius Nerva kept secret notes of every crime and every cruel act he witnessed. He wrote them in code, recording not just the people who died, but also the fear that haunted those left alive. These hidden pages would one day become a roadmap for the plotters, helping them see patterns in Domitian's cruelty and exposing weak points in his power. The sight of 12 empty Senate chairs would soon give 12 surviving senators an idea. If Domitian could strike down 12, then 12 men could rise together to strike him down. On September 13th, Emperor Titus was struck by a sudden fever. Servants whispered in alarm, noticing that Domitian had already dressed himself in purple robes, as though he were ready to step into his brother's place before the end had even come. The year 81 CE marked a sharp turn in Rome's fate. The peaceful reign of Titus ended, and the dark rule of Domitian began. Titus, loved deeply by the people, lay dying in the very villa where his father, Vespasian, had passed away years earlier. But where Vespasian's death had been calm and expected, Titus's last hours were clouded in suspicion. Only days before, he had appeared healthy, traveling along the Bay of Naples and speaking eagerly of new projects for the city. Then, all at once, came chills, burning fever, and confusion symptoms that matched poisons known in Rome, though no solid proof was ever uncovered. What no one could deny was Domitian's strange behavior as his brother faded. He entered the villa with an escort already calling him emperor, as if the outcome had been decided in advance. Witnesses later recalled chilling details. Domitian barred certain trusted doctors from approaching, insisting only his own physician be near Titus. When the dying emperor begged for ice to ease the fire in his body, Domitian reportedly refused. And when Titus finally slipped away, Domitian was already racing to Rome to secure power. The doctor who tended to Titus would vanish not long after, but before disappearing, he confided a secret in a tavern to a trusted friend. He claimed Domitian hovered over every treatment, mixing medicines with his own hands, even tasting the broth before Titus drank. The physician described Domitian as a man watching a clock, counting the moments until death arrived. Domitian's first act as ruler left no doubt about his hunger for control. Before announcing Titus's passing or preparing his funeral, he ordered the Praetorian Guard to swear loyalty to him alone. He handed out gold as rewards, money that seemed ready long before his brother's death. The Senate was given no choice: bow to Domitian or face immediate violence. Even Titus's funeral was rushed. A man so adored by Rome should have been honored with weeks of mourning, with long, glorious ceremonies. Instead, Domitian hurried through the rites, more eager to cement his power than to grieve. At the cremation, he stood uncomfortably close to the pyre, his face flickering in the firelight, and those who saw him swore the flames revealed something cruel beneath his carefully composed mask. The same Praetorian Guard that lifted him to power would remember that sight, and 15 years later, they would not lift a hand when 7 blades cut him down. But the roots of Domitian's cruelty stretched far back to the boy he once was. At 16, he wandered the halls of the palace, realizing that he was alone, his mother gone, his sister gone, his father and brother far away. It was the year 67 CE, and silence wrapped around him like a cage. While his father Vespasian and his brother Titus fought for glory in Judea, Domitian stayed in Rome, overlooked and forgotten. The palace, though filled with gold and marble, felt more like a prison than a home. He could not even remember his mother's face, only the emptiness left behind by her absence. His sister died not long after, leaving him the last of his generation. Raised by distant servants who gave him only the barest care, he grew up knowing he mattered less than Titus, the chosen heir. Even his very name seemed to mark him as lesser Domitian, the one who lived in another's shadow. The chaotic year of the 4 emperors left its mark as well. While his father seized the throne and his brother proved himself a warrior, Domitian stayed behind in Rome, powerless, frightened, and invisible. Out of that loneliness and neglect, a monster began to take shape, one that would one day wear the crown of Rome. From the high windows of the palace, the young boy had seen the chaos of Rome with his own eyes: soldiers, fighting soldiers, men swearing loyalty to rival emperors and cutting each other down in the streets. Once, rebels had chased him across the Capitoline Hill, and he only escaped by throwing on the robes of an Isis priest and slipping past the mob. The shame of that disguise burned inside him far longer than the fear of the moment. Standing later in those cold, echoing halls, the forgotten child made a vow to himself: if no one cared enough to notice him, then one day the whole world would hear his roar. If love was denied to him, then fear would be the only bond he demanded. From that day, he began to picture a future where no one could ever walk away from him again. A world where chains and dungeons would keep people close, no matter the cost. Even the palace cats seemed to sense something was wrong. They avoided the boy like a shadow. Servants whispered about finding dead creatures in the gardens, little bodies taken apart with unsettling care. His tutors noticed the same darkness in his studies. When other children wrote essays about virtue or justice, his thoughts always circled back to cruelty, pain, and punishment. One teacher, shaken after reading an essay filled with elaborate methods of torment, begged to be reassigned. What began with insects soon moved to mice, then to cats, and eventually dogs. Each act of cruelty gave him a strange rush, like a hole in his chest was being filled for the first time. He discovered he could stretch out their suffering, learning that the fear before the blow could wound just as deeply as the blow itself. That lonely, angry boy would one day sit on the throne of Rome, but the hollow silence of those empty corridors would never leave him. It would instead take shape as torture chambers, where others would feel the same cold isolation he had known. When Titus was 8, he dined at grand tables with princes and future emperors, surrounded by laughter and silver platters. At that same age, Domitian crouched behind doors, peeking through thin cracks, his stomach twisting with resentment. The year was 59 CE, and though the brothers lived under the same roof, they might as well have lived in different worlds. Titus was polished and prepared, tutored by Rome's finest teachers, trained with real swords alongside Britannicus, son of the Emperor Claudius himself. Meanwhile, Domitian was handed worn scrolls and taught by second-rate instructors who barely looked at him. He became a shadow at the edge of his brother's glory, watching Titus shine beneath Rome's brightest lights while he himself remained invisible. One memory clung to him like a scar. Nero, the emperor, came to dinner. Titus was chosen to stand before the mighty ruler and recite poetry, his voice smooth, his performance flawless. Applause and praise filled the room, and Domitian, trying to sneak inside, was stopped by a guard who shoved him back. "Family only," the man said, not even realizing the boy he turned away was Vespasian's other son. Even in his drawings, the darkness showed. While other children filled pages with horses and soldiers, Domitian sketched devices of pain, twisted images of suffering. In the margins of his books, he underlined lines about torture, adding little notes about how the punishments might be made worse. In the Iliad, while others dreamed of the glory of heroes, he was fascinated by the torment of Prometheus, trapped under the eagle's beak. The cruelty of those lines became seeds for his own imagination. On the very day his brother Titus earned his first military honor, Domitian sat alone with a dove he had captured from the palace rooftop. As the household cheered for Titus, he plucked feather after feather from the trembling bird, whispering to it as though it were his brother. "This is for leaving me behind. This is for loving him more. This is for forgetting me." Each cruel word hardened him further, until his anger was no longer just a child's tantrum, but the slow forging of a man who would one day make his rage Rome's burden. In his head, he built whole worlds where Titus came crawling to him, begging for his approval. He imagined his father finally opening his eyes and realizing which son was truly worthy of power. He pictured all of Rome bowing down, no longer ignoring him, but forced to see him at last. That lonely child peeking through a crack in the door had already begun designing the tools that would one day make an empire notice him. And now we return to September 18th, 96 CE. The palace floor was slick with blood, and 7 blades tore into Domitian's body. But by this point, it wasn't just a murder, it was justice sharpened into steel. Each thrust carried years of pain and rage. Stephanus drove his knife for the Vestal virgins. Maximus struck for the 12 senators who had been slaughtered. Curtius remembered his tortured brother. Clavius cut for the Christians thrown into fire. Every wound was a voice speaking back to the screams that had echoed through those halls. Domitian's final struggle was telling. His nails raked across Stephanus's eyes, not in fear, but in the same cruel instinct that had once guided red-hot irons. Even with death wrapping its hands around him, he chose to hurt rather than beg. Those hands that clawed at his killers were the same ones that had signed death sentences, selected torture devices, and applauded when victims broke. The irony was sharp. The emperor who had made torture so intimate was now being killed in the closest, most personal way by men who knew him, who had served him, who had watched the child turn into a monster. He died as he had lived, angry, desperate, and alone. He may have ruled millions, commanded armies, and even called himself a god, but in the end, he was just a man with no love, No loyalty, and no one left to care. Witnesses said he tried to speak at the end, but the blood in his throat silenced him. Whatever final speech he had prepared, like so many he had given in life, died with him, unsaid. When word reached the Senate, their joy was explosive. After 15 years of bowing their heads in fear, they suddenly roared with curses, tearing into his memory. They ordered his statues destroyed, his name scraped from stone, his very existence erased. The damnatio memoria, the curse of memory, was voted without hesitation. Even his wife, Demetia, who some whispered had helped plan his death, refused to claim his body. No grand funeral, no public mourning, no honor. Instead, it was his nurse, Phyllis, perhaps the only person who had ever cared for him, who quietly collected his corpse. She cremated him without ceremony and mingled his ashes with those of Julia, Titus's daughter, the same young woman he had seduced and forced into tragedy. The torture chambers he had so carefully crafted were emptied within hours. Men and women marked for unspeakable agony were suddenly set free, saved by 7 daggers. The iron tools, the grotesque machines, the bronze bowl, every cruel invention was smashed or melted down. Rome wanted no trace of his horrors. And yet, scars remained. Families still grieved lost sons and daughters. Christians carried wounds in their bodies and in their faith. The Senate chamber still had empty seats where friends had once sat. Years of neighbors betraying neighbors had left Rome raw and broken. Domitian thought he could live forever through fear, and in a way, he did. Rome tried to erase him, but history refused. His cruelty was too shocking, too unforgettable. He became the model tyrant, the dark reminder of what happens when power devours the man who holds it. Every emperor who came after him was compared to the extremes he had reached. Any ruler who chose cruelty was weighed against the horrors he invented. After his death, priests tried to cleanse the palace with sacred rituals, desperate to wash away the years of screams and blood. But the guards whispered unsettling stories in the years that followed, cries echoing down empty corridors, the stench of flesh burning where no flames burned, and shadows twisting along the walls like broken bodies still writhing in pain. Maybe it was just their imagination. Or maybe some wounds sink too deep for even holy water to wash clean. His mark on the world didn't end with his death. The gruesome research done in his torture rooms, carefully recorded in hidden scrolls, later gave doctors knowledge about the human body they never would have had otherwise. The strict methods he created to keep track of victims eventually shaped Rome's system of administration. Without meaning to, a man who only wanted to master suffering had accidentally pushed forward other fields of knowledge. That was the cruelest irony of all. Today, people stroll through the ruins of Domitian's palace on Palatine Hill. Tourists pose for photos, point out the mosaics, and marvel at the arches, not realizing they're standing where terrified voices once echoed off those same walls. The guidebooks mention he was a ruthless emperor, but they keep the truth neat and polite. They don't talk about the red-hot irons he used so often. Yet if you know where to look, the ruins still carry his shadow. You can see stone blocks with cuts where drains once carried away blood, anchor points where chains had been bolted, and scorch marks blackening certain walls. Stone remembers what people try to forget. Domitian wanted statues and temples to make him immortal, to be worshipped as a god. Instead, history remembers him as a beast in human skin. The 7 daggers that ended him were not swung by divine hands, yet they carried the weight of divine justice. The boy who once swore that the world would hear his screams had achieved it, only to learn that screams never stay silent. They always come back home. In the end, his ashes were quietly placed in a plain urn, mixed with the remains of a young woman he had forced into tragedy. No honors, no mourning. The man who demanded worship from millions could not stir grief from a single heart. His beloved torture machines were destroyed, melted down into coins stamped with the face of his successor, Nerva, the very man who had watched innocence burn and had finally decided it must end. Rome moved forward, as it always did, but it carried with it a scar and a hard lesson. People had seen firsthand that monsters don't appear fully grown. They are shaped slowly, by loneliness, by resentment, and finally armed with too much power. Domitian's rule taught Rome that cruelty is like a disease. It spreads if you don't cut it out in time. And so 7 blades carved him from history on that September morning. The emperor who spent his life designing ways to stretch out pain learned the final truth himself, that whoever chooses to live by iron will eventually be struck down by steel. No dungeon, no blade, no fiery device could ever force true love or loyalty. His 15 years of terror ended not in glory, not with the mighty farewell he imagined, but in the plainest way possible. 7 men, 7 strikes, 7 wounds, and at last silence.